Well, thank you all so much for being here, for showing up for this. We called it a workshop. I'm actually not sure it's really a workshop. I think it's more like a talk. But we'll see if we can blend that in a little bit more to a dialogue. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. Let's begin now. I've handed out a printout of the Mandukya Upanishad, which is what we're here to talk about today. And this is it. One page, front and back. It fits on one sheet of paper. And the gist of the Upanishad is exceedingly simple, and it can really be stated in one short sentence. I'm not going to tell you what the sentence is yet. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I've spent hundreds of hours studying this Upanishad and the scores of commentaries on the Upanishad, none of which, by the way, are only one page long. So they're all exceedingly long commentaries. And when we start to study and analyze the Upanishad, unpacking its meaning and its nuances, it unfolds in a way that's almost miraculous. And I found myself completely in awe because I looked at this one page and I said to myself, being inherently lazy, if this one Upanishad will lead to liberation, lead to moksha, to freedom, then I'm just going to study this one because I don't have to worry about all the other stuff that's been written over the last 2,500 years. I can just study this one and achieve liberation very quickly that way. But what I found was the most amazing thing. It unfolds in ways that are almost explosive. So I'd find one word in the Upanishad, and I'd start to ask, what is that word? Like Atma or Atman. And then I'd start looking up Atman, and it just goes on forever what Atman is. And every single word, every single idea in the Mandukya Upanishad is that way. And so my head was exploding because this little thing was becoming so immense that it was almost unimaginable. And I started to ask myself, did I do the right thing? Have I taken the right step here in taking up this Upanishad that I thought would be, pretty simple and straightforward and that I could easily understand? And eventually I reconciled myself with the fact that we can't know intellectually everything. Some things we have to simply start to feel and to experience. And that's what the Upanishad, the Mandukya Upanishad is all about. It's not about intellectualizing. It's not about studying, really. It's about practicing. And we'll talk more about that as we move through this. As I prepared for my talk, just following up on that theme for a minute today, I took all my notes that I had created over hundreds of hours on the Upanishad, as well as the commentaries, which are called Karika, K-A-R-I-K-A. Most of the time, that's what they're called. And I compressed them down into only 100 pages of single-space type, and I figure, all right, with this 100 pages, I can tell everyone everything that I think I've learned in this study. And then I realized, I actually sent out an email that some of you saw saying, who would like to come to this compressed study of the Mandukya Upanishad? It'll only be 10 hours. We'll do it over 3 or 4 sessions, maybe 3 hours or 4 hours per session. And almost everyone responded and said, that seems like a long time to invest. And so I stood back and I said, all right, 100 pages is too much. I'm trying to give too much information. And so I simplified it, and I think I have everything down, compacted now into 60 minutes or 90 minutes, somewhere in that range, okay? And that's what we're going to do today. So I have one simple message for you regarding the Mandukya Upanishad, and that is chant Om until you know who you are. That's the essence of the message of this work. Chant Om until you know who you are. Take a couple of moments. Let your eyes close down. And we're going to chant in a way that you may not have done before. It's going to be soft. It's going to be gentle. And the sounds are going to be ah, oo, and And then as we repeat, there's going to be a break. And find that silence. Find the break. Let's begin. Ah, let the go. Find the silence. Take a deep breath. Just let the vibrations reverberate through your body, through your tongue, through your head. All right, you can open your eyes now if you like. You perceive me as an object. You see me with boundaries, my skin. And I see you the same way, a lot of objects in our environment. That's the way we experience reality, for the most part. We see things, and each thing is separate from each other thing. That's the nature of our experience of the reality that we live in. As enlightened beings, the rishis of old, rishi is, does everybody know that word? Rishi is R-I-S-H, if you like, I. And the rishi were sages. There were sages of old. But the rishis were enlightened beings. And they saw that the separateness that we experience is an illusion. It isn't real. I am separate from other things. I am separate from you. Not really. What the rishis saw is that the forms we perceive in the world come and go. And I know most of you have studied yoga philosophy and many of the ancient texts, and so you know this idea that prakriti, that the reality that we see and we exist in, comes and goes. It's not static, it's ever-changing. These forms in Sanskrit are called rupa, R-U-P-A, which just means form. And we give the forms names, and name in Sanskrit is nama. So this system of objects that we all experience in our reality is called nama-rupa. And each rupa, each form, has a name. And each name results in a vibration from our body. That vibration causes a response in your mind. And the response it causes is for you to associate it with a rupa, with a particular form. And the example that's often given in the scriptures is of a snake. So when I say snake, that's a vibration coming from me, ending with you, maybe even going beyond you. In any event, you perceive that vibration from my use of the nama, snake, and then snake causes a particular formation, a mental formation in your mind. And so you think of what a snake looks like, you think of maybe the behavioral characteristics of a snake, and then we form those associations between nama and rupa. And as we learn those associations, that's how we begin to experience the world. We experience the world as separate objects in our environment. The rishis saw that the underlying temporary forms, that there was something else that was there. And there was an underlying fabric of reality. And that fabric of reality was ever constant. It never changed. And they gave that fabric, that underlying reality, a name. And I know many of you know the name. What's the name that the rishis gave to that fabric? Brahma, or Brahman, B-R-A-H-A or H-A-M. Let me illustrate that. What is this? Hard to see. You're too far away. Why is everybody so far away from me? The question just occurred to me. What is this? It's a pot, right? Nama, at least in English, is pot. And the rupa is this form. It could be a bunch of different forms, but it's this particular form. This particular form was given to me by one of my children, and so I have an attachment to this form. And I see the form as fixed and unchanging, as I expect you probably do too. But the truth is this form is not fixed and unchanging. What's going to happen over time, we know, is it's going to deteriorate. Maybe it's going to drop on the floor and it'll break into pieces, but eventually this form will no longer exist. What is this form made of? What is the stuff that gave rise to this form? Clay. Yeah. So clay was molded and formed and became the pot. The clay existed before the pot existed. The clay will exist after the pot is gone. So this form changes. The clay underlying it, like Brahman, does not change. It's unchanging and it underlies everything, every form that exists. Another common analogy is to use the idea of a wave. You've heard this, I'm sure, many times. So a wave arises in the ocean and it flows for a distance, and then the wave settles down eventually and returns to the ocean. The wave was a form, it was rupa, it arose. And then it settled back down and became what it always was the ocean. The ocean pre-existed the form of the wave, and the ocean exists after the wave is gone. The wave is temporary, rupa. The ocean is eternal and divine, if you like. It is Brahman. Okay? Does that make sense? Yeah. So intellectually, we can understand that, and I think the analogies are helpful in understanding the relationship between the temporary forms that we see in the world and that which underlies all those forms. That's the wisdom of the Upanishads, is this idea, the brilliant insight, in fact, that there is something which underlies all the temporary forms, and that that underlying reality they named Brahman. They could have named it anything. It could have been called iPad, or it could have been called, prayer flag. It happens to be called Brahman. There isn't, in most traditions, there is a significance to the word Brahman, but for our purposes, it doesn't really matter. It's just a sound, and the sound invokes the idea of Brahman. So it's not that these temporary forms don't exist. That was a difficult thing for me to understand. Is the temporariness of the forms doesn't mean they aren't, quote, real. They are real. So when you see a form, when you recognize yourself as a form or other people as a form or objects in your environment, when you understand that they are temporary and that they come and go, it doesn't mean that they don't exist. They do exist. That's not the illusion. The problem is that we forget that the forms are transient and we become attached to the forms. As I said with the pot, my son made this and I'm very attached to it. And when it breaks or disintegrates, maybe within my lifetime, I'll suffer. And I suffer because I've forgotten that this is transient and it won't always exist. And so when it becomes what it always has been, which is a temporary form, then I'm upset because it's not there anymore. And as a result, I suffer. My suffering arises not from the illusion of permanence of this. My suffering arises because I've forgotten that it's not permanent. That was the second great insight of the rishis, was that when forms change, we forget that they're always going to change. That is their nature. And as a result of the change, we suffer. As long as we continue to believe the temporary forms are the whole of reality, then the suffering will always arise. The rishis realized, as the Buddha had about the same time, by the way. The Buddha was about 500 before the Common Era, BCE, and the rishis were about the same time, some back maybe 1,000, 1,200 BCE, some later than that. But they realized that people suffer because of their forgetfulness about the nature of the underlying reality. So to relieve this suffering, all people need to do is to let go of the illusion of persistence and separateness, and that would lead to liberation from ignorance. But there was a problem. The problem is that this relationship between us and Namarupa is very, very strong, and we form deep attachments to these forms, including our own, that we see as the reality of the world. It's possible to wake up from this illusion of separateness through intellectual power, brain power, but it's a very, very difficult thing to do. So part of the underlying reality of Brahman was reflected in the human form. And so the rishis asked the question, what does it mean to be human? They knew that the form we call a human consisted of a physical body, and that physical body could be weighed and it could be measured, and it could be touched and it could be held. But they also knew that the physical body was temporary. It came and went. We're born, and each of us in turn dies. So they saw that the human being was more than just the human form. To be human included non-material aspects. And we could call that non-material aspect the subtle body. The subtle body animates the physical body. It gives it movement. It gives it its underlying consciousness, which we'll talk about in much more greater detail. The subtle body doesn't arise and fall. It's not ever changing. It's not born and it doesn't die, at least in most lineages. And let me pause for a moment here just to say that Indian philosophy and spirituality is not a whole. There isn't just one canon of Indian beliefs. There are scores and scores of different strains, and some are in conflict with one another. We're going to talk about dualism and non-dualism, which are huge differences, but they're both part of Indian philosophy and the Indian philosophical canon. So what I'm presenting to you today is kind of an amalgamation of the non-dualistic strain of Indian thinking over the ages. But if every single thing I say, you could find something in some scripture that contradicts it. It's just the way it is. It's because all these scriptures are individual views, for the most part, of different sages, different writings. So the subtle body. The subtle body reflects an energy that's called Atman. And it's Atman that gives humans consciousness. And it's consciousness that makes us aware of all of our experiences of reality. It's because of Atman that we seem to witness all of our perceptions. So, for example, imagine that you cut your finger. You feel pain because you cut your finger, I assume. That pain is part of your consciousness. And any animal will feel pain, at least anyone that has a nervous system, just like we do, or in the same sense that we do. But there's something different about humans and maybe other animals. I'm not going to get into that topic quite yet, or at least not today. But there's something different about humans, and we have the experience, or the ability rather, not just to feel the pain, but to be aware, to be conscious of the fact that we are experiencing pain. So there's the pain itself is one step, and then sitting back from the pain, we can look at our mind and say, your mind is feeling pain. And that's the watcher aspect of our nature, our ability to experience our experiences. And that is, at least in the view of many, what makes human beings unique and different from all other forms in our reality is that witnessing capability, the witnessing awareness. The rishis looked at human consciousness, human awareness of experience, and what they worked out was that there were 4 phases of that experiencing. There's a phase that experiences the external. There's a phase that experiences the internal, the stuff going on in the mind activities. There's a third phase that lets go of the boundary between internal and external and is just watching, but without any perception because there's nothing to perceive. So it's standing ready to perceive, but there's nothing within the world that is available for perception. And then there's a fourth phase that's even beyond that, where the watcher, the witness, loses its coherence, where it loses its boundary and stops being a separate thing in the universe and merges with everything else. That state, they didn't even label it, they just called it the fourth state. And fourth in Sanskrit is this word, T-U-R-I-Y-A, it's kind of a Y, Turiya. Turiya simply means fourth. So knowledge of Atman, of the nature of human consciousness, can lead, the Rishi said, they reasoned, to liberation. But the problem is it was very difficult to do that. And so they were looking for a simpler way, a simpler path towards liberation that didn't require so much brain power. And let me explain why that's so. In the world, you can be told about experiences that others have had. And we've all experienced that. So someone can tell you what the scent of a rose is like. They can describe it. They could write a poem about it. They could write out a long paragraph or even a whole book in prose explaining what the scent of a rose was. But the problem is that hearing that explanation isn't the same as smelling a rose yourself. The rishis understood that difference. They understood that experience was different from knowledge. And so the question becomes, what kind of experience could we have that would be like the experience of the phases of Atman in the human body, but not exactly the same, but enough that we could draw an analogy and come close. And what they found is that there was a sound, and that the sound had 4 phases as well, just like Atman. And that by chanting that sound, if you did it diligently and if you connected the 4 phases of the sound to the 4 phases of consciousness in the human, that you could then come to know Atman, because you could come to experience in a way that was beyond just knowledge, beyond intellectual understanding. Now, the reason that there are 4 phases in the sound and 4 phases in Atman is because both are emanations of Brahman. So it makes sense that they would have the same structure, and indeed they do. This sound is Om. When we chanted a bit ago, we chanted A, U, and Those are the 3 first phases of Om. And then I invited you to find silence after the 3 phases so that we could experience the silence. And the silence is representative or analogous to the state of Turiya. So when we chant Om, we invoke the vibrations of the sound of Om, and that connects us eventually to the full form, the full breadth of Atman. So these insights of the rishis were recorded in the Mandukya Upanishad. And the Upanishad itself gives us effectively a roadmap for using Om to achieve spiritual awakening. At the root, what it says is experience Om, and you will experience Atman. And by chanting Om, we can find our way from illusion to liberation. Okay? All right. The title of this talk is Spiritual Awakening through Om. And so I thought that we might at least ask the question, what does spiritual awakening mean? Clearly, we need something more than abstract knowledge to get us there. What is spiritual awakening in the Indian tradition? You guys know. Give me a name for spiritual awakening. Moksha. Moksha, that's a good one. M-O-K-S-A or M-O-K-S-H-A, depending on how you want to transliterate that. Moksha means liberation, freedom. Another name, one near and dear to our hearts, Samadhi. There are different phases of Samadhi depending on which traditions you look at. There's an ultimate Samadhi, which is like Moksha, which is just a release of everything. So there are no boundaries with anything. Kaivalya is a type of spiritual awakening, and there are many more. Nirvana is another one. There are many other that we can find as we work our way through the spiritual traditions. And all of these involve an awakening. And the question is, what are we awakening from as we move towards spiritual awareness? And the answer is probably forgetfulness is, I think, the best way it's expressed in the literature, in the scriptures. Forgetfulness about the fact that we are not separate from one another, but that at our essence, we are all the same. And that's the most important teaching. We'll come back to that. So spiritual awakening means to move from ignorance to truth. And while there are a lot of techniques to accomplish that, one of them is through chanting Om, and that's obviously what we're talking about today, and that's the technique that is laid out in the Mandukya Upanishad. Let your eyes close again. Breathe in deeply and exhale, let the breath go. Let's chant again. Inhale again. Aum. Inhale and exhale. All right, what are those sounds? What are the sounds? No? A-U-M, yeah. But the sounds are not in the Roman alphabet. The sounds are a language. And what is that language? Sanskrit. What is Sanskrit? It's an ancient language. It was spoken long before it was written down, or at least scholars believe so. And what do we call this wall in this studio? The Sanskrit wall, right? Is it a Sanskrit wall? No, it really isn't. Is this Sanskrit? What is this? This is a written expression of a language, but the written expression isn't Sanskrit. It's called Devanagari, D-E-V-A-N-A-G-R-I. And Devanagari is a particular alphabet. It's a way of writing sounds. Sounds in linguistics are called phonemes, and each phoneme in each language, each written language, will have a particular character, a particular expression. So I've been referring to this, the Sanskrit wall, for like 10 years now. I may have to modify that because I know it's not, so it's not accurate. And each of these characters is associated with a particular phoneme, a particular sound. So what is the phoneme? What is the character or characters for the sound we were just making, the sound we were chanting? Hopefully you'll be able to see this. Can you see that? All right. This is in Devanagari, Devanagari, Om. This is the A, this is the U, and this is the M. It looks kind of like a 4. And in Devanagari, everything has a line at the top. There's also a diacritic mark at the top here, and there's a mark at the bottom, and those identify particular characteristics of the combined sound of A, U, and M. So here's the A, printed it out really big. Can you see it in the back? Okay. In Devanagari again. And the U, which is, you see the 3, and then that's the M at the end. So combined AUM. And then this mark at the bottom is telling us that there's a sound at the end, there's a space at the end, a silence at the end that you need to observe. So this should be Om, right? But so on your mug at home or your t-shirt or whatever it is, you have an Om, right, written down? Is it this? It's this. So I thought we ought at least know, since we're talking about what Om is, we ought to at least know what this is. What is this? This is just another way to write Om. And this is cursive, basically, and it's also combining the letters. And then this at the top is called a Chandra Bindu. So Bindu is dot in Sanskrit, Chandra is moon. And so this is a combination of these letters and kind of set in cursive. And this is mostly what you see. I'm sure it's around here somewhere. It's got to be all over the place. But this is the commercialized Om. Nothing the matter with it. It's just, it has a derivation that I think is important to understand. You also see Om not as A-U-M in English or Roman characters, but as O-M. How do we get that? How did that come to be? And should we be chanting Om instead of A-U-M? What's the difference between the two? Well, in classical Sanskrit, and classical here means more modern, not older, but in classical Sanskrit, when A is followed by a U sound, the combined sound ends up as an O. Okay? It's just the linguistic convention. It started about 1,200 years ago or so. Before that, the sound was not one syllable, but the three plus the silence at the end that we've chanted twice now. The A, U, M. And so I think you could correctly chant either way. You could chant Om, Om, Om if you wanted, or you can chant A, U, M. I like A, U, because first that's how the Mandukya Upanishad tells us to chant the sound. And secondly, because it's more representative of the older tradition, the more ancient tradition. But having said that, after you chant A-U-M for a while, and we'll talk about chanting as well later on, after you chant A-U-M for a while, you'll find it probably compressing into more of an Om sound. And as long as you're making the associations in your mind as you're chanting between the four phases of Om, the external, the internal, the neither external or internal, and the silence at the end, Turiya. As long as you're making those associations, as long as they arise naturally for you, I don't think it matters how you chant. You can do it in whatever way you like. All right. Questions so far? All right, let's talk very briefly about the historical background of the Mandukya Upanishad. The Upanishads are part of an ancient Vedic tradition. Beginning obviously with the Vedas, there were four Vedas. Those are the oldest works. Then there were Upanishads. The Upanishads total about 200 that scholars know about, and of the 200, there are 10 or 15 that are said to be the main ones, the principal ones. Those are the ones that if you buy a book on the Upanishads, as Janie did, I know because I have the same book, it'll contain those Upanishads. There are a variety of different translations of those as well. Then there are commentaries on the Upanishads that expand on them, and there are many commentaries. Some of the commentaries arise at almost the same time the Upanishads were written, a specific Upanishad. Others are much more modern. And then there are people who are commenting on the commentaries. The commentaries you'll see go by the name of Karika, K-A-R-I-K-A. So the most famous of the commentaries, the Karika on the Mandukya Upanishad is Gaudapada's commentary or Karika. And then there are hundreds and hundreds of expositions on the various commentaries, both new and old. The scholars really don't agree too much about when the Mandukya was written. Some say as early as 500 BCE, some say as late as 200 CE. Just to put it in perspective, the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, which I know every one of you has studied, right? Yeah, is 400, the year 400, give or take 10, in the Common Era, at least according to the scholar Philip Maas, who's a German scholar who's really specialized in that dating of the Yoga Sutra. And he's pretty certain it's within 10 years of the year 400. So the Mandukya, either 500 or 200 CE in the Common Era. It's pretty broad swath. We really don't know. The Christian Bible came together in about 300, 325, just to give you some historical perspective so you can place the Mandukya in time. What does Mandukya mean? I've got a yoga mat, and my yoga mat is made by a company called Mandukya. And Mandukya and Mandukya are the same root word. And the root word probably means frog. We're not exactly sure. But my mat has a frog on it. I wondered for a long time, what in the world is that little thing on my mat? That little red mark? That's a frog. So Mandukya probably means frog. And then this is part of the rabbit hole you get into when you start studying this stuff. And I started looking at, why would it be called frog? What does frog mean? Was the person who wrote it a frog? Did he rib it? What was the deal with him? And there are all kinds of theories about why this was called Mandukya. And you can read all about those, and then there are criticisms of each theory. It's kind of like getting stuck on the internet in a social, one of the social platforms. There are lots and lots of different opinions. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter what Mandukya means. There are lots of different explanations and lots of different definitions. Let's go back to Atman and Brahman briefly. Atman and Brahman are both central concepts in the Indian spiritual tradition, and particularly in Vedanta philosophy. Vedanta is composed of the Sanskrit words Veda, which we've talked about. Those were the four early writings. And Anta means end of. So Vedanta refers to the end of the Vedantic period. So in that Vedanta philosophy, Atman is translated oftentimes as self or as soul. And it's considered to be the innermost essence of every individual. It's the individualized aspect of the ultimate reality. The ultimate reality is what we talked about before, Brahman. A common analogy used to explain the relationship between Atman and Brahman is back to the ocean and the waves. So Atman is a wave rising up. It's the individualized expression of the water, of the ocean. And Brahman is the ocean that never changes. It's always the same. So Atman is the wave that rises up. It becomes for a time an individual expression of the underlying ultimate reality of the world, which is the ocean. And then eventually it settles back down. The wave loses its form, and we return to our awareness to the ocean, which has been there all along, and it's never changed. So Atman and Brahman are considered to be the same essence, but they are different manifestations of that essence. Atman is the individual soul, and Brahman is often talked about as being the universal soul. Another interesting thing I just want to mention, then we'll move on, is that unlike all the other Upanishads, the Mandukya Upanishad, which you have on the sheet in front of you, is there anybody who didn't get one? The Mandukya Upanishad doesn't tell stories, and it doesn't appeal to people through analogies. At least not explicitly. See, you have the frog on your mouth. Instead, it's very simple and it's straightforward in its advice to chant Om and to free yourself from illusion, to find moksha through the simple chanting of Om. All right, let's talk briefly about the philosophical context in which the Mandukya arose. And let me say this. There were two great philosophies. One was dualism. And in dualism, the idea was that God, or the divine, or the ultimate, whatever you want to call it, and everything else were separate from one another. They didn't merge into oneness. And that in Sanskrit is called D-V-A-I-T-A, which can be pronounced a whole bunch of different ways, which is why I haven't pronounced it yet. You can pronounce it Dvaita, so the V becomes a W sound. You can pronounce it Davita. You can pronounce it Davaita. And you can pronounce it probably in 100 other different ways. Why? Because the language wasn't pronounced the same way in different parts of India. India is a vast country, and the pronunciations in the south are very different from the pronunciations in the north and east and west. They're also very different. So in any event, what it means is dual, or two. And the other great philosophy is Advaita. And the A in front means not in Sanskrit. So it means not dual. So you might ask yourself, why don't we just say oneness? And the answer is because when we define all that is, the ultimate, by giving it a name like one, like oneness, then we're automatically creating a division between it and everything else, or at least that's the theory. And so the idea is that we just say it's not dual. And so we're referring to what it's not, and instead of referring to what it is. And in that way, we define it as unitary, as not dual. In the Advaita world, the non-dual world, there are forms that we talked about at the very beginning that are called rupa, and those forms exist in the universe, in our reality. And each human is a separate form, and those forms run around, they interact with one another. But there is something more in the world than just that form, and that's Brahman, the ultimate reality, the ocean from which all waves arise and to which eventually all waves return. So the question is, when a wave arises in the ocean and you see it, can you remain aware of the ocean? Can you remain aware of the fact that the wave is the ocean? And can you do that not as an intellectual exercise, but in terms of your actual perception? That's the hard part. That's the difficult part. The other thing to remember about the philosophy that existed at the time that this work was composed is that they were very concerned with the human condition, with the human state of suffering. And they saw that suffering arose from the fact that we didn't see the world the way that it was. We were sucked in by this illusion of separateness. And in our separate world, our illusionary world, we seek happiness, and we seek happiness by associating with other things in the world. And when we do that, we draw connections between what we perceive, the objects that we perceive in the world, between one object and another object. And so what we're focused on in that way of experiencing the world is the differences between things. So I look out and I see a bunch of people, and I see some people that are tall and some people that are small, and some people have beards and some people don't have beards. Some people have lighter skin, some people have darker skin, and I see all these differences. So is it any wonder when what I'm experiencing are differences that I see separateness arising from those differences? But if you shift your focus, if you shift your perspective so you're no longer looking at the differences, you're instead looking at what is the same, you shift your awareness to the inside, to the essence of everything. And what is the essence of everything? The essence of everything is Brahman. So when we see that everything is really composed of Brahman, that Brahman is the fabric which underlies the illusionary world that we experience, then we can shift that perspective and see not separateness, but that everything is, in a very real way, the same. And that sameness is the brilliance of the Advaita philosophy. Our dualistic view, does everybody live in dualism, or is it just me? I'm asking you seriously. Do you live in dualism? Do you see separateness everywhere? Some of you, yes, some of you are enlightened. I like that. I'll talk to you afterwards. When you live in dualism, you continually strive for happiness. And you strive for happiness by seeing things as separate from one another, and by wanting some things, and by pushing other things away. I love chocolate, and so I go home, and I'll have a piece of chocolate out of our special chocolate drawer in the house, in the kitchen, and I'll eat it, and I'll say, that's wonderful. That makes me so happy to eat that piece of chocolate. Wow, that is really good. Then I'll go back to the drawer for another piece of chocolate, because the first one made me happy. The next piece is really going to make me happy. And what I find is that the drawer is empty and there's no more chocolate in the drawer. So now what? Now I suffer. I suffer because what I wanted, I can't have anymore, and I see the chocolate as separate from me. I experience the chocolate as a separate object in reality. And because I can't have what I want, I feel suffering. I feel a loss. Nothing was really ever lost, because the essence of the chocolate was the same as the essence of me. So the two aren't separate things. Some years ago, my wife passed away unexpectedly. And she had a sister, and she and her sister were extremely close. They were amazingly close to one another. And as time passed, her sister could not shake the loss that she felt. And so 6 months, 9 months later, she called and she wanted to talk, and she came over and we sat down and talked. And I asked her, what's the matter? What's going on? She said, I just feel the separation. She's not here anymore. I can't experience her. And it's so incredibly painful. I don't really want to go on with my life anymore, because the loss is so deep and so hurtful. And I thought for a little bit. And I reminded her something she knew, which was that the sister, my wife, was still there. Her essence hadn't gone anywhere. In many ways, she still existed as memories in all our brains. And her essence had continued to exist in the universe. It didn't leave. So there was no separation between what my sister-in-law was feeling and the object that she thought she'd lost. That object was really always part of her, and she was part of her sister. And as soon as she realized that, which she did by stages over a period of about a month, then the feeling of loss completely went away. And she felt at peace with what had happened. To me, it was one of the most beautiful demonstrations of how we can bring into our lives, our daily lives, this wonderful teaching of non-dualism, and how shifting the perspective from I've lost something and therefore I'm unhappy, or I'm angry, or I'm upset, or I'm feeling a deep loss, to it is so wonderful that I can still experience the wholeness of the world. Just that slight shift can make a huge difference in the way you experience your life. So what the Upanishad, the Mandukya, is telling us is that shift your perspective. Stop looking at everything as separate from everything else, and instead begin to realize that everything is not separate. Dualism is not accurate. It's a false view of the world. And once you do that, then you don't have to worry about happiness or unhappiness or any of those other emotions. And that the mechanism for doing that, the technique rather for doing that, is simply through chanting Om. Let your eyes close. Chant on your own now. Ah, oo, and the silence. Either silently or out loud, your choice. Let your chanting come to an end, and just let the vibration remain. All right, let your eyes open again. The Upanishad is 12 short, concise verses. You can also call them slokas, S-L-O-K-A, or mantra, sometimes they're called. Analytically, let's divide the Mandukya into three parts. There's an introduction, which is the first verse and part of the second. And then the second part of the Mandukya tells us about human nature, about what Atman is, and defines the four phases of Atman. Then 8 through 12, verses 8 through 12, tell us about the phases or states or modes of Om and how we can compare the two, the states, the four states of Atman and the four states of Om. So, as usual, I'm not moving nearly as quickly as I had hoped I would. So, and we do have to give up this room at 3:30. So let me move straight into what the Mandukya tells us about Atman. There's a first stage of consciousness of the human being, which is oriented outside to the external, to external objects. And it's called Vyasvanara. Vyasvanara. So it's externally oriented. So that's the first stage, and that's what you see when you experience your world most of the time. You see things outside of you, you see things as separate from one another, you see objects that are different from one another. Okay? In that state of consciousness, there is a witness, which is your consciousness, your awareness, and that witness is seeing the stuff outside. So there's a separation between what you're experiencing as the experiencer and the objects that are the subject or object of your awareness, of your experience. Okay? Then there's a second state, and the second state moves inward. Oh, the first state is referred to as waking, by the way. There's a second state, which is referred to as the dream state, or dreaming, and that is Taijasa, Taijasa. And in the second state, there's still a witness, there's a witnessing awareness that's you. But what you are experiencing is stuff that's going on in the mind. So the awareness has become internal now, and your awareness is not of things that can be held, weighed, and measured, but of things that are mind stuff, like the scent of a rose, or the feeling of loss, or anger, or anything else that might go on in your mind. Then there's a third phase where the witness still exists, the witnessing awareness. And this is just called sleep or dreamless sleep in the Upanishad. And I think the most helpful way to think about this is to imagine the witness, your witnessing awareness, in a dark void. So close your eyes for a minute. And now notice you're still aware. But also imagine or visualize that there's nothing left to perceive. There are no objects, either external or mind stuff. You can open your eyes back up. So there's a witnessing awareness within a void that is available to perceive, but there's nothing to perceive. So you might ask, why isn't there anything to perceive anymore? Where has it gone? Well, the human in this stage, in this third stage of dreamless sleep, which is called prajna, P-R-A-J-N-A, prajna. In this third state, what's happened is that the boundary between external and internal has evaporated. It's dissolved. That boundary no longer exists. And if the boundary doesn't exist, then there can be neither external objects nor internal objects. And as a result of not being internal or external objects, there's no longer anything for the witnessing awareness to perceive. So the witnessing awareness is just hanging out in the black void, waiting for stuff to happen, and nothing's happening. That's the third state. And then the fourth state is really not a state at all, but this is the state called Turiya, called the fourth, T-U-R-I-Y-A. And in Turiya, what has happened is that the boundary between the witnessing awareness and the void in which the witnessing awareness exists has dissolved. So the witnessing awareness has been merged into Brahman, into the underlying fabric of reality, into all that is. I never read anything in all of my studies that actually said that. Instead, they talked about the witnessing awareness merging into, or object and subject merging into one another. It never made any sense to me until I realized that what they were talking about was the dissolution of the boundary between the witnessing awareness. So in this third stage in prajna, the third stage of human consciousness, of Atman, there's still witnessing awareness that's separate from everything else. And once you let go of that witnessing awareness, then you reach the ultimate, then you reach moksha, where even the witnessing awareness itself, that innermost part of Atman, is not separate from what's being observed or what might be available to be observed. And that's the ultimate reality. That's what happens. So the rishis in the Mandukya Upanishad tell us in verses 2 through 7 that these are the phases of Atman. Let me give you another analogy that I found really helpful in trying to understand Atman and how Atman relates to our little individual selves. Imagine the sun. Excuse my crude drawing. That's the sun. And now imagine a bucket. This is going to be even cruder. All right, can you pretend that's a bucket? All right. And imagine that the bucket is filled with water. The bucket is our physical body in this analogy, and the water in the bucket is the subtle body. Atman is universal. Atman shines on the water in the bucket, and then it's reflected off of the water out back into the world. So if we have another human over here with another bucket for their body and more water, then Atman will shine on that water as well. So, and then reflect out. So there's an individual Atman, which is the reflection of the sun in the sky, and it is Atman that gives rise to our witnessing awareness, of our consciousness, our awareness of our awareness, our awareness of our consciousness. The bucket will eventually disintegrate and fall apart. And when that happens, what happens? All the water will leak out. And when the water leaks out, what happens? There's no reflection of Atman. And then little baby bucket is formed, and it gets a subtle body, and then it reflects Atman and grows and so on. So I just think it's a wonderful analogy. I wanted to pass it on in the hope that it might inform in some small way your understanding of what I think could be a really difficult concept, and that is, what is this idea of Atman? All right, so the Upanishad has told us that there are 4 phases of human consciousness, and the Upanishad then tells us that there are also 4 phases of Om, the 4 that I went over a moment ago. The waking state, the dreaming state, the dreamless sleep state, and the state that's called fourth, in which everything else is dissolved into oneness, and duality no longer exists. So next the Upanishad says, because the experience of Om and its 4 phases, if you do it correctly by chanting, will inform your experience of Atman if you just chant. It doesn't require any intellectual power, right? You don't have to work very hard in your brain to do it. You just chant. And so if you chant, and you, in your chanting, associate, in your mind while you're chanting, associate the 4 phases of Om with the 4 phases of Atman, eventually you'll come to a state of awareness where you're not focused on any one object, but the awareness is now diffuse. So we could compare it to Patanjali if you wanted to, coming to the 7th limb of Patanjali's Yoga Shastra, where the meditation is a diffuse meditation, and you're not focused on any one thing anymore. You become simply aware of everything all at once. That, in Patanjali's telling, becomes Samadhi. And in the Mandukya's discussion, that becomes the state of moksha. So how do we do that? How do we associate those things? The Upanishad doesn't tell us. It would be really hard for it to do that in one page. But many of the commentaries do, and many of the commentaries that are written within 500, 600 years of the Mandukya itself. And what they generally suggest is that you simply chant A, U, and by the way, those sounds in Sanskrit are called kara, K-A-R-A means sound. So when you're reading about this, if you do, you may find the word akara, which means a sound, and it's like father, ah, as we were chanting before. And ukara, ooh, that sound. And makara, usually with an M-A in English, and then K-A-R-A. And then the whole sound of Om is called Omkara, O-M-K, A. I guess I'm not good at writing sideways. R-A, Omkara. Sometimes you'll see that as Onkara, O-N-K-A-R-A, because there isn't always agreement on how we transliterate these things. So anyway, it says chant Om, A-U-M, plus the silence, until you come to a state of diffuse awareness. And once you come to that state, you'll find yourself releasing the boundaries that create the illusion of separateness in the world. Now, you could do that just by intellectual power. If your brain is powerful enough, you'd be able to do that maybe. And there are stories of people being liberated through intellectual ability. But the beauty of this, and the amazing consequence of practicing the Mandukya Upanishad, is that you don't really need to do anything except chant Om. And then associate the 4 parts of Om with the 4 parts of human awareness, the consciousness, the Atman. And at least in my case, I do not claim to be enlightened by any measure, so I don't want you to make that association. But I can come to a place where that diffuse awareness exists. It arises in the meditation, and then it'll persist for a bit. I don't know how long, because time really doesn't become relevant anymore. Time is another thing that has boundaries. Time itself is a boundary. Separating time from space is creating another boundary. It's creating another separation. creating a boundary, you also create boundaries between time, space, and things. And those boundaries, at least in the Mandukya tradition, those boundaries don't really exist either. So the oneness doesn't just extend to oneness of stuff in the universe. It extends to oneness of everything, time, space, and matter. Those are convenient ways for us to navigate the world that we live in. And they're also important because we do have to navigate. Once you come to a place where you recognize non-dualism and you can experience it in your life in some way, even for a nanosecond, it doesn't mean that everything else is left aside. I think John Kabat-Zinn was the one who wrote one of my favorite meditation books called After Enlightenment Laundry. And what he was saying in the book is that even when you achieve enlightenment, you still have to do your laundry. It's still there to do. The same is true here. You still need to be able to recognize all these things. But what the Mandukya is telling us is that we can shift our perspective, and you can say to yourself, okay, now I am of the perspective of a jiva, J-I-V-A, a little egoic person running around in the world. And I exist in the world, and if I walk out in the street and stand in front of a bus as it's zooming by, I'm going to get hit, and my body, the bucket, is going to die, and all of the subtle body inside it is going to leak out. All that water is going to be gone, and I'm not going to be conscious anymore, at least not in this form. But I can shift my perspective through this practice until I can begin to recognize, maybe again just for a nanosecond, that this experience is not the only experience you can have of the world, that you can experience the world in a non-dualistic way. And that ultimately is what the Mandukya, I think, is telling us, is practice Om. Do it diligently until you come to a place in your practice where you can let go even a little bit of the sense of non-dualism and experience that non-dualism. And then maybe you can return to it again next time, and maybe 2 nanoseconds, or maybe 3 nanoseconds next time. All right. I wanted to leave a little bit of time if you have questions or if there are thoughts that you want to offer, because I've pretty much monopolized the talking. But I do want to open it up. So if there's anything anybody else wants to offer from their study or from their practice or questions that you have, now's the time. Yeah.
So when practicing it, is that a silent?
Yeah, thank you. Good question. So the question for the recording is, do you practice the mantra silently, or do you practice it out loud, japa? And the answer is you can do either. My recommendation is japa first, so do it out loud, until you can make that connection between the 4 parts of Om and the 4 parts of the consciousness of Atman on a pretty regular basis. So it's not an effort, and you're not struggling to make that connection. And it flows freely for you. And then once you have gotten to that point, then see how it feels to do it silently and just to begin to chant internally, but the same way. And then if that evolves into an OM instead of an AUM sound, that's fine too. Oh, let me also just mention quickly, a lot of the commentary, and I should mention I didn't before. In the course of my study of all this, I studied a lot, 10 different translations from the Devanagari Sanskrit version of the Mandukya to English. And I compared and contrasted those and kind of came up with one that I thought, because each of them has good parts and parts that aren't so good, and I tried to combine them all into a single translation. I haven't completed that project, but it's coming close. So there are lots of different translations, and the translations can mean very different things. So if you read one translation and it says something that doesn't quite resonate with you, go read a different translation. The one I like, and the one, by the way, that I've handed out to you, is Swami Rama's translation. And I think it's closest to the one that I created by bringing all the other translations together. I've also read all the commentaries. So there are thousands and thousands of pages of commentaries, and then the commentaries on the commentaries. So, and I mean, if you want to, go read it all. It's really fascinating stuff, both historically and from a spiritual point of view. Anyway, so to complete the answer to your question, yeah, I would start with japa, with an external sound. And notice, I don't have the 4 stages of Atman up anymore, but that's also moving in the same direction. So it's starting with the external of the Om sound, moving the sound internally, and then eventually you come to a place in your practice where the sound itself almost evaporates when you find that place of diffuse awareness. Okay. Okay. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Hi, Derek.
I've read Swami Rama's, I've read this translation as well, and it's a larger question. How does Mandukya fit in with the constellation of other Upanishads, or relative to the arc of all the texts? I know you mentioned that there's no like storytelling here; it's just kind of brass tacks, matter of fact. What makes it unique, one of the features that makes it unique, but I'm curious if you could maybe pull back the larger picture of Upanishads and where this fits in.
Yeah. So Derek's question is, how does the Mandukya fit in with the other Upanishads, or at least that's how I heard it. The Mandukya is by far the shortest, and it's the most direct. So the Upanishads, in general, teach by analogy, and or they teach by story. The Mandukya is much more like a recipe, like in a cookbook. And what it's saying is, here's this, those are the ingredients, put those things together, and here's the method, just chant, and then you're going to find moksha. It's really unique in that way. The Mandukya has been said in a variety of other Upanishads to be the only wisdom that you need, the only practice, the only sadhana that you need to practice. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do other practices. It means if you want to find just one, this is the one to do. In terms of time, it probably comes in the midpoint, although we don't really know because we're not sure when the others were written as well. But it's clearly part of the Advaita, the non-dualistic philosophical trend of the Upanishads. So timing kind of in the middle, but it's really an outlier. It's really unique, at least in my experience. It's really unique in terms of the other Upanishads in what it's telling you to do. It was intended as something that was incredibly accessible to everyone. It didn't matter who you were. It didn't matter what your state was, your status was in life. This is something everyone could do. And that's what it was telling people, is this is how you do it. Anybody else? Wow. So it's 3:29, and Amelia said that we had to be out of here at 3:30 because because Jasmine is doing a massage thing starting at 4, and she needed to set up. So I promised her we'd be out And I'm not exactly sure how we did it, but we've come to that point where we can exit. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for listening. Please enjoy your study. If you have questions, let me know. I'd be happy to try and answer. Take care.